Okay, so the motivational independent activities in acting is an additional ingredient that you can use in your acting to be able to add to your acting work. And what is specifically very interesting about motivation is that motivation, it's the active concentration. It's the active concentration in your acting. So it's the internal motivation that's actively, it's active. So when you're understanding that, and when you're understanding that it's an internal motivation and it's active, this is what motivation actually is by definition in acting. Now, this can be very helpful to your acting work because when you're adding motivation to your acting work, it means that you're adding something that can jostle something else around in your emotional preparation work. And what it can end up doing is it can end up being tremendous for you. It can end up making your emotional preparation work. So when you're dealing with this topic, you want to take and find things and add to your process. Now, acting's complicated, but this is how we have to break it down to try and make it more simple. Because the thing about it is simple, but at the same time it's very complicated because it has to do with every single bit of intricacy of human interest. And that's what acting actually is. So as these writings in the website are there to be able to help you not quit acting, the motivation isn't about not quitting acting. The motivation is there so that you can add another intrigue or an interest or another active internal stimulation. So the first thing to understand here is that you set up your acting work, whatever process you're using, you set it up so that your acting work is set up with all the different things that you're set it up with. And then the last thing that you add to it is motivation. And you add a motivation. And when you're adding a motivation, you want to make sure that it's something that actually genuinely motivates you. It could be very imaginary. So let's say you've set up your acting work and you've got something to do for an imaginary boss, and you've got to get the task done. And you have your emotional preparation that you've done, so you have your active feeling, and you've got something working for you, and then the very last ingredient you pull out is motivation. And you give yourself a real motivation so that if something that was imaginary in life, it was motivated, that it would actually succeed. Now, this will get your work somewhere that you didn't expect it. Because what will end up happening when you're working with motivation is you're going to end up being in a situation that a surprise might happen to you when you add the act of adding the motivation. Because instead of a dormant state of emotion where you've done your emotional preparation and it didn't really click, or maybe it did but it was only a little bit, or you've added a feeling to your work, and the feeling, we all have to understand that feelings are fleeting. They come and they go very quickly. Sometimes you can catch them in your work and sometimes you can't. So then we work on this typical thing called emotional preparation. And emotional preparation is the emotion that goes into your work. And the emotion has to activate. But then what happens is sometimes, depending upon the emotion might be something that just sits. You might feel a great shame. So emotion of shame doesn't have an active component to it unless it's being activated by something external, which usually will happen within the work, which is the reason why we don't pontificate unless it's very intentional. We want to be able to be in a situation where we're not performing. So in order to be able to not perform in your acting, you want to add the ingredient of motivation. So you're adding the motivation ingredient, and your motivation ingredient, and it could be something as simple as you want to get it done because your imaginary boss at your job said that they would take you to the film premiere if you got the task done. It's a simple motivation. Now, the way for that motivation to work for you would be for you to have your boss be somebody that you like or like to work for, somebody that you have some sort of liking towards, that you want to please them. That would be helpful. But you also would want to be able to pick something that you really actually wanted to be. So you wanted to go to a specific actor that you really wanted to be at the premiere to, or you wanted to be on a specific topic that you were really interested in. So then you've got an actual real motivation that's added to the work. Now, what ends up happening when you add this thing called motivation, you end up adding this is incredible aspect, because you've added the emotional preparation, you've added a feeling. Now, the feeling might be swinging around in you and you might still feel it. You've added the original. So we're going back to the actor's triangle. The first way that you've been able to get your work together is you've added the idea, and you've thought of an idea that you thought would work for yourself. Then you add feelings that you actually are working with, so that you can remember feelings and you can resonate with feelings. And then you resonate with those feelings until you get to an emotion. Now, you get yourself into an emotional state. Now, a lot of emotional states are very, 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 very quiet and still. So this is a point in the work where a lot of actors don't know what to do with motivation in their independent activities, and they don't know how to deal with motivation in acting. Because this isn't something that they're not motivated to do acting, this is the motivation in acting. So you've got your acting triangle, and you pull in an ingredient called meaning. So you have another thing called meaning that you work with, and you've kind of determined with the meaning what something might actually mean to you in order to find your motivation. So then you find your motivation, you bring in something that's an additional ingredient to your emotional preparation or to your acting preparation, because this will work right across the board for many different acting styles. And you bring this in, and you work with it so that the emotion it will be very alive, but it will be within you, but it might be very still. And you learn to be comfortable with that still emotion. So you might do this preparation that we're working on right now, where you're going to be doing an independent activity for a boss, and you need to be able to get this done by a certain time. You've got that figured out. You've got to get the task done. You know it means something because you work with the meaning. You add all of these different ingredients out. And I know we're doing this loosely, but this is the way the actors really do. So the actors and students, however it is, and I'm talking even actors on professional sets, they do very, very loosely. And they swim around these ideas with the directors until they find that there's some sort of kind of awakeness within the director, or the director says to the actor, you've got something awake in you now let's do this scene. And this is how acting works. And then the actor starts the scene, and then they work between the two different interactions, and they try and catch the interaction on camera. And it's messy like this. The emotional preparation is a mess sometimes, and that's not a mistake that you're doing. the emotional preparation and the preparation working with motive, you bring in motive as the last ingredient. I can teach textbook emotional preparation, but textbook emotional preparation isn't the way it usually happens, but it can if you're that skilled. So you have the emotion that's inside of you that would be pressure. Say that's the only emotion from the emotional preparation that you've come up with. You have a desire, but the only real emotion is pressure. Now this is very common when people go to do independent activities in acting. The only emotion that they end up coming up with is pressure. So they could either sit in a pressured state and hope that something will happen within their acting that will actually make it awake and alive. Or, and will, as they're doing the activity, and hope that there's something within their activity or something within the interaction, either combination, that will waken them up and have something interesting happen. And it might be subtly interesting. It means people, acting nerds like myself, will find it interesting. But the thing is that it's interesting for the audience as well, because it will be subtle, but there'll be something alive there. There'll be some sort of anticipation that something might occur, and nobody will know what that will actually be. But when you've got this element called motivation, and you intentionally give yourself a motivation to get this activity done, well, now you're in a situation where you're really empowering your own acting work so that you can practically guarantee that you have an active circumstance in your acting. So this is not going to be something that's dull or null and void. This is something that's going to be active. It has something that's active inside of you. There is definitely a motivation. Now, I don't know any teacher. I've sat through so many acting classes I couldn't even tell you. I mean, the first year it was nearly 1,000. And I've been doing this for many, many years. Studying. I have never, I've never heard of people talking about how to bring in the intentional thing called motivation into your acting work. And if you're aware of people that do it, that's great. I'm happy for them. But I'm bringing you something that I know that will be something that will actually be an ingredient that if you bring that in, even if you have a boring emotion that you're feeling, and emotions, a lot of emotions are boring. They're not interesting to watch. Some of them are interesting to watch, but it just depends if they're activated or not and how they've been activated. So if you bring in a motivation, and then you know that that motivation is when your work starts to activate, then you're bringing into your work an element that's actually going to help your acting succeed. And that what that does is it helps bring motivation into your independent activities. So your independent activities are alive and awake. Now sometimes the action of applying yourself into a doing, which is what an independent activity is. It is an independent doing. Sometimes the action of doing will stimulate motivation. And I've seen it many times, and it's wonderful. But you can't depend solely on the work being the activating factor if you're going to work with this in a really, really incredible way. Otherwise, you will be depending upon the accidents in acting in order to be able to work for you. And hopefully they'll happen often enough, because not every single independent activity will activate a motivation. So it's rather important. You want to achieve this for your own good in acting. you want to achieve understanding that these levels of acting and the work are something that's intricate enough to be able to work with so that you can actually have a thing called acting craft. So you're developing your acting craft. If you're at the point in the work, which is really where you trust the work level to be at. So if you're trusting the work level to be at the point where you're trying to trust that there is a possibility that an independent activity could spur something, then that's where you're at. But if you're at the point where you've done multiple independent activities and you're really set and you're committed to doing those and you're feeling like there's things that are stuck, you know for certain if you go and find a motivation within yourself and you apply that into the layers of the work that you've actually completed, and you add that into your emotional preparation time or your actor preparation time, then you will have an active circumstance happen within you, and then with that active motivation, you'll then have motivation to get your activity done. And that's the ideal. That's the ideal. And you should be able to do that 90% of the time. Honestly, it should.